we're going to waste no time introducing our guest of the day. She is a journalist at The Gray Zone and an author whose new book is Corporate Coup, Venezuela and the End of U.S. Empire. You all know who she is, but if you don't, this will be a good introduction. Anya Parampil. Anya, great to see you.
My pleasure to be here. Nice to see you guys.
Thanks.
Welcome.
Absolutely. Yes. So you had a book launch last week where Russell met you. So congratulations on that. That's awesome.
Thank you.
So speaking of which, you can see it behind me, Corporate Coup here.
Oh, let's hold that a little closer. Let's hold that a little closer because I knew you had it.
And so far, I am really enjoying it. Not only is it very informative, and like a lot of people who came out of the Bernie Sanders left, frankly, I need to be informed. Very often we share the deficit of Bernie Sanders of not being as informed in foreign policy as we should be. So not only is this informative, but it's actually a very good read. A lot of times these kinds of things can be very academic. They're very dry. I'm sitting there like a Stephen King novel. I'm like, so what happens next? What happens next to the Venezuelans? Does the clown come out of the sewer? So it's very good. So first question, and this struck me, right? You really opened with this. So you describe Caracas as this kind of bustling metropolis where nobody's fighting for toilet paper or canned goods, very unlike the impression that we get in the Western media. So what would you say about the state of Venezuela today? Is it very much at odds with what we see in the media? Is it just a normal country? Is it prosperous? How would you describe it?
Well, just as a disclaimer, it has been since before I had my daughter. So it's been over 3 years since I have traveled to Venezuela, but I saw it a lot between the years 2019 and 2021. And at that time, from what I understand, the economy was weaker than it is now. And at the time that I knew it, it was improving from its lowest point. Its lowest point, as I document in the book, was 2015, 2016, 2017, when the Obama administration really launched the hybrid economic war against Venezuela, targeting it as a national security threat or classifying it as such according to U.S. law, and issuing a round of sanctions that had the effect of crushing the commodities market in Venezuela, because something I explained in the book is that ever since the 1920s, when oil was discovered in Venezuela, the country was forcibly, from foreign powers, kept as this kind of petrostate. And then that makes sense, because if there's so much wealth that can be made out of one industry in a country like Venezuela, it has the most crude oil out of any country in the world by far, even like over double what Saudi Arabia has.
Well, yeah, you mentioned that World War II, the Allied victory was largely fueled with Venezuelan oil. You said 80% of oil going to England was coming out of Venezuela?
Exactly. So the UK was entirely dependent on oil exports during World War II. And by the time the US entered the war, 80% of UK oil imports were coming from Venezuela. And that was because of a classic colonial imperial kind of relationship the U.S. and Britain maintained with Venezuela. Total control, U.S. companies mainly, control over its domestic oil industry. And so that created a state that was very dependent on oil money. And because as long as they gave the oil at the price Britain and the international powers wanted to the international market, they would in exchange get all the goods that we produce all around the world: toilet paper, baby food, formula, and be able to import that as a sort of exchange. And so Venezuela didn't have the chance to develop its own domestic capacity to produce a lot of these goods over those decades. And that is something that predated Chavez's rise to power in Venezuela. But then in 2015, 2016, when these sanctions come down, that's when Venezuela really starts to feel the effect of the the sanctions and the fact that they were so dependent on the international economy to import basic goods for all that time.
Right.
That's when we see these shortages, these lines, a lot of images of empty supermarket shelves that people might remember. And of course, the Western media simply printed these images and said it was the fault of communism or socialism,
Right.
not acknowledging that the vast majority of Venezuela's economy is still run by private corporations. I mean, people should understand these supermarkets are not run by the government. Hotels, restaurants, anything, it's shopping malls, clothing stores. When you visit those types of businesses in Venezuela, they're not state owned. They're operated by the private sector. And so the private sector was cut off from capital and from basic goods as a result of these sanctions. Western media gets to pump it out and blame socialism. And then ultimately the US's goal was to collapse the government just by creating that level of unrest. Venezuela intervened in the crisis, as I document in the book. We can talk about the CLAP program through this government program where they actually delivered basic supplies, goods to people, millions of Venezuelan households on a monthly basis, virtually free of charge. And they were able to do that by crafting these alliances with countries such as Turkey and China that could supply them with capital, but also goods like pasta and flour that
Right.
they put in these clap boxes. And so that was a remedy to the situation. And then ultimately, since Venezuela's made some adjustments to its currency and just domestic financial policy over the last few years, Venezuela's economy and the situation there has improved. Their goods are back on the shelves. Things are back to some sort of relative normal. But from when I speak to people now, what I hear is that the problem is just, as we're experiencing in the U.S., inflation has gone down a lot in Venezuela, I should say. Like there was the time of hyperinflation that was crazy, but it is still difficult to afford goods. I mean, but that's just something I think we're experiencing everywhere, all around the world at this point. But I'll hopefully be able to give a better, more complete update on Venezuela today by the end of the year, because I plan on visiting in the next several months.
Well, you talked a little bit about the Venezuelan model there. You made the point, obviously, that most businesses remain private there. So when, Western leaders demagogue about Venezuelan socialism, what are they talking about? Are they talking more about nationalization of resources?
Yes. And of course, this is the most threatening aspect of Venezuelan socialism, is the fact that one of the first acts the government under Chavez took was to nationalize the natural wealth. Any of the resources under the continental shelf, it's in their constitution, is owned by the people, and any wealth procured from that natural wealth or resource that exists, it's not just oil, by the way. There's gold. Venezuela has the largest untapped gold deposits in the world, scrap iron, minerals, all of these raw materials really that are needed on the international market. Venezuela is super well endowed with these resources. And so it's in the constitution that these goods belong to the people. The wealth cannot be transferred to a foreign entity, meaning a foreign corporation or a foreign government. And that upended the relationship that the transatlantic powers had with Venezuela ever since, all throughout the last century, ever since oil was discovered there. And so this is the evil socialism that Bolton and Elliot Abrams are concerned about. It's simply a question of who controls the oil and the natural wealth, because we would like our banks and our corporations to get our hands on all of that. And they stated that openly. Bolton said, we would really, our American companies stand by ready to exploit Venezuelan oil if there's a change in government. So that was something that was really interesting about the Trump administration and Bolton's existence within it, is that it really ripped the mask off of U.S. Venezuela policy in many ways, and made it very clear that this was about simply wealth, not a question of democracy or human rights or big abstractions.